Before we get into the rest of our program, I want to do a little bit of what might be a throwback Thursday moment, if this were in fact Thursday, and that is this. Regular listeners to the program will remember that a couple weeks ago, I marveled at the fact that Citigroup, the mega bank that was created by bipartisan consensus during the Bill Clinton years, and the Republicans wrote the bill, the Clinton administration helped push it through, and then Clinton Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin wound up being the CEO eventually. Now, that Citigroup, which has paid billions in fines, as all our big banks have, was fined $700 million. That's, of course, $750 million. And nobody really seemed to pay very much attention to it. It was so routine by now to see banks guilty of fraud, to see nobody go to jail for that fraud, and to see these huge settlements go out, of course, paid for by the shareholders and not the criminal actors themselves, that it wasn't even worthy of mention anymore when a major American bank, and by some measures the largest, pays $750 million nearly in fines and settlements. Now, August 17th, 2015, that is to say this week, in the New York Times, Citigroup to pay $180 million over collapsed hedge funds. Now, I don't mean to be unfair to Citigroup. They're all crooks, okay? Citigroup just happens to be the one that's been in the dock lately. Citigroup, says the New York Times, agreed to pay $180 million to settle charges by the Securities and Exchange Commission that the bank concealed problems at two of its now defunct hedge funds while taking in additional investments in the months before the financial crisis. Now, let me break that sentence down for you. First of all, let's parse that sentence for a minute here, okay? It's agreed to pay $180 million to settle charges by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Right there, that's got to stop. Okay. In other words, they don't get to settle charges anymore. I want to see people in court. You want to see people in court. It's time to make that happen. It would be a lot better if the chair of the SEC was not personally so deeply enmeshed, both in her family life and in her own past and perhaps future career with the big banks, that it's impossible to encourage them to enforce these laws properly, in my opinion. But now, so they settled charges instead of prosecuting, that the bank concealed problems at two of its now defunct hedge funds while taking in additional investments in the months before the financial crisis. Now, if I sell you a car and I know it has problems that will make it soon defunct, and I conceal that from you while taking in your money for the car, that's fraud. This is big scale fraud. This is really big scale fraud. Now, it took 7 years for them to come to this settlement, as the Times reports, quote, saddling investors with billions of dollars in losses. Okay, let me parse that for you. Billions of dollars in losses, 180 million in fines. Do the math. Who got shafted here? All right. Billions in losses, 180 million in fine. The Citigroup hedge funds used large amounts of leverage or borrowed money. Guess what? They're still super leveraged out on Wall Street now. To bolster returns from municipal bonds and other fixed income investments, they were sold to investors by Citigroup's financial advisors working for the bank's former Smith Barney wealth management unit. But in 2002, 2007 and early 2008, the fund's managers, and again, I'm quoting the Times, failed to inform the thousands of investors in the funds about a severe shortage of liquidity and margin calls from lenders providing the leverage to the funds. Okay, so they were forced, on several occasions, the funds were forced to sell billions of dollars in assets to meet margin calls, but did not disclose these sales to investors. Instead, they were telling them everything was fine, even as managers of one fund were drawing up, quote-unquote, liquidation scenarios. Even Citigroup wouldn't extend emergency liquidity to its own hedge funds. It let them go down. It let investors use billions after they had been deceived. That's why people hate Wall Street, not because of some irrational prejudice, but because these big banks, created by the generosity of the American taxpayer, saved by the generosity of the taxpayer, turn around and screw the American taxpayer over and over and over, and it's got to stop. And if we don't put presidents and administrations in there who will stop it, we got to keep changing them until we find somebody who will. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.